For decades, I believed being a good mother meant never saying no, never resting, and always putting everyone else first. But at 75, I finally realized something shocking. Sacrificing myself did not make my children love me more. What I discovered instead changed everything about my life, my peace, and even my relationships. This is the story of how I chose myself for the first time and the lessons every parent needs to hear. I was 75 years old when I finally admitted something I had never allowed myself to say out loud before, that being a good mother had slowly, quietly erased me. I didn't arrive at that realization in a dramatic moment. There was no argument, no betrayal, no single event that forced the truth into the open. It came the way most honest realizations do at my age, softly, in the stillness, when life finally grows quiet enough that you can hear your own thoughts again. I was standing alone in my kitchen one early morning, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, when it struck me that I had spent most of my life doing what I thought was right, what was expected, what earned approval. And I was tired in a way rest could no longer fix. Not physically tired, though that was part of it, but tired in my spirit, tired in my bones, tired in the part of me that had never been allowed to rest because someone always needed something from me. For decades, I wore the title of good mother like armor. I believed it protected my children, gave them stability, love, and a sense of safety. And perhaps it did in many ways. I was present. I showed up. I remembered birthdays, packed lunches, stayed up late worrying, and woke up early making sure everything was ready for everyone else. I swallowed my frustrations, softened my voice when I wanted to scream, and told myself that this was what love looked like, that a good mother sacrifices, a good mother endures, a good mother does not complain. Somewhere along the way, those beliefs hardened into rules I lived by without question. I didn't ask whether they were fair. I didn't ask whether they were sustainable. I only asked whether I was doing enough. The truth is, I don't remember when I stopped asking myself what I wanted. It wasn't a conscious decision. It happened slowly, like a shoreline eroding grain by grain. Each time I put someone else first, it felt noble. Each time I delayed my own needs, it felt responsible. And each time I ignored the quiet voice inside me that whispered, "What about you?" I told myself there would be time later. Later when the children were grown. Later when things were calmer. Later when I had earned it. But later kept moving farther away, and before I knew it, decades had passed. By the time I reached my 70s, my children were adults with lives of their own. They had careers, families, routines that no longer revolved around me. From the outside, this was the stage of life when a mother is supposed to rest, to enjoy the fruits of her labor. People would say, "You must be so proud." And I was. I truly was. But pride is not the same as fulfillment, and pride does not fill the empty spaces left behind when your identity has been built entirely around being needed. When the phone stopped ringing as often, when the requests slowed, when I was no longer the center holding everything together, I felt something unsettling rise to the surface. Not relief, not freedom, but a hollow confusion. If I wasn't constantly caring for someone else, who was I? At 75, I began to notice how often I felt invisible. Not mistreated, not abused, just unseen. My children loved me, I know that, but love had taken on a new shape, one that did not require my constant presence, my endless availability. They assumed I would always be there, always willing, always understanding, and because I had trained them to expect that version of me, I couldn't entirely blame them. I had spent years teaching them that my needs were flexible, negotiable, optional, that I would adjust, that I would manage, that I would be fine. I had become so good at being the good mother that no one questioned whether it was costing me something. The cost revealed itself in quiet ways, in the tightness in my chest when I agreed to things I didn't want to do, in the resentment I felt and then immediately buried because it didn't match the image I had of myself, in the sadness that crept in during moments of stillness when there was nothing left to distract me from the truth. I began to see how often I minimized my own feelings, how quickly I dismissed my own discomfort, how deeply I had internalized the belief that my role was to make things easier for everyone else, even at my own expense. I didn't see myself as a martyr, I saw myself as responsible. But responsibility, I was beginning to understand, can become a prison when it is never balanced with self-respect. Letting go of being the good mother didn't mean I stopped loving my children. That misconception haunted me at first. I worried that even thinking these thoughts made me selfish, ungrateful, or cold. For years, my sense of worth had been tied to how much I gave. To question that felt like questioning my entire life. But the deeper truth was this: I was exhausted from performing goodness instead of living honestly. I was tired of being measured by how accommodating I was, how available I remained, how much of myself I could still give even after I had nothing left. At 75, I didn't want to perform anymore. I wanted to be real. The morning I truly acknowledged this, nothing changed on the outside. The dishes were still in the sink. The calendar still had obligations written in neat ink. The world did not pause to acknowledge my internal shift. But inside me, something loosened. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that being a good mother was not the same as being a whole person, that love did not require self-erasure, that perhaps I had misunderstood what goodness really meant. It wasn't about endless sacrifice. It wasn't about being endlessly agreeable. It wasn't about disappearing quietly so others could shine. Goodness, I was beginning to see, might also include honesty, boundaries, and the courage to exist as myself, even if it made others uncomfortable. I didn't announce this realization to my children. I didn't make a speech or demand understanding. At my age, I knew better than to expect immediate validation. Instead, I sat with it. I let it settle into my bones. I observed how often I still defaulted to old habits, how quickly guilt surfaced when I imagined choosing myself. The guilt was powerful, sharp, and deeply ingrained. It told me I was being dramatic, that other mothers had it worse, that I should be grateful. And I was grateful, but gratitude should not require silence. Gratitude should not cost a person their voice. By the end of that year, I understood something fundamental. I could no longer live the rest of my life trying to be who I had been at 40. I was 75. Time was no longer something to spend carelessly. Every remaining year mattered. Every remaining day deserved honesty. Letting go of being the good mother didn't mean becoming a bad one. It meant releasing the version of motherhood that demanded my disappearance. It meant allowing myself to exist beyond my usefulness. It meant acknowledging, at last, that I was more than what I provided. That realization was not freeing at first. It was frightening. Because when you stop performing a role you've played your entire life, you're left standing in unfamiliar territory. But even in that fear, there was relief, a quiet, trembling relief. At 75, I was finally ready to ask a question I had avoided my whole life. Who am I when I am no longer trying to be good? After that realization settled in me, I began to notice how deeply the role of the good mother was woven into every part of my daily life. It wasn't just in the big decisions or the obvious sacrifices. It lived in the smallest moments, the automatic responses, the reflex to put myself last without even thinking. I noticed it when my phone rang, and my first instinct was to answer immediately, no matter what I was doing or how I felt. I noticed it when I rearranged my schedule around other people's needs before checking in with my own. I noticed it when I felt a familiar tightening in my chest at the idea of disappointing someone, even in situations where my participation was optional. These patterns had been rehearsed so many times over the years that they felt like part of my nature, not learned behavior. Seeing them clearly for the first time was unsettling. It was like discovering that a room you've lived in your entire life has no windows, and you're only just realizing how dark it has been. What surprised me most was how much resistance rose up inside me when I tried to change even one small thing. I had imagined that once I understood the problem, the solution would come naturally. But awareness did not immediately bring freedom, it brought discomfort. The first time I hesitated before saying yes to a request, my heart raced as if I were doing something dangerous. The guilt arrived instantly, loud and insistent, reminding me of everything I had been taught. A good mother doesn't hesitate. A good mother doesn't prioritize herself. A good mother doesn't need time to think. That voice had guided me for so long that challenging it felt almost disloyal, not just to my children, but to the woman I believed I was supposed to be. I remember one particular afternoon when my daughter called, asking if I could help with something last minute. It wasn't an emergency, it wasn't even especially important, but it was familiar, one of those requests that had always fit easily into my life because I made room for it, no matter the cost. That day, I had already planned to rest. My body ached, my mind felt crowded, and for the first time, I paused. The pause itself felt radical. In that silence, I weighed my options not based on what would make me seem loving, but on what I could realistically give without resentment. When I finally said gently that I couldn't help that day, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. She wasn't angry, she wasn't cruel, she was simply surprised. And in that moment, I realized how deeply I had trained everyone, including myself, to expect my constant availability. After the call ended, I sat alone with the aftermath. My hands trembled slightly. I felt selfish, relieved, proud, and ashamed all at once. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, wondering if I had sounded cold, if I had damaged something irreparably. This was the emotional residue of decades of self-neglect. I had been so conditioned to equate love with compliance that choosing myself felt like betrayal. Yet beneath the guilt, there was a strange lightness. I hadn't explained myself, I hadn't over-apologized, I hadn't offered to make it up later. I had simply stated my boundary and let it stand. The world didn't end, the relationship didn't collapse, but something inside me shifted. In the days that followed, I became more aware of how often I managed other people's emotions at the expense of my own. I had spent a lifetime smoothing things over, anticipating discomfort, and adjusting my behavior to avoid conflict. This habit had been praised. People called me patient, understanding, easygoing. What they didn't see was how much of that patience was fueled by fear, the fear of being seen as difficult, ungrateful, or unloving. At 75, I no longer had the energy to perform emotional labor that went unnoticed and unreciprocated. I began to understand that my exhaustion wasn't just physical or emotional, it was existential. I was tired of disappearing. Letting go of the good mother identity also forced me to confront how little space I had given myself to change. I had clung to the same version of myself for decades, even as my body aged and my circumstances shifted. I believed consistency was a virtue, that changing meant admitting failure. But growth, I was learning, doesn't stop at a certain age. It simply becomes quieter, more internal. The changes I was making weren't dramatic or visible to others, but they were profound to me. I stopped rushing. I stopped filling every silence. I allowed myself to be unavailable without explanation. These were small acts, but they carried enormous emotional weight. There were moments when my children noticed, not always in words, but in tone, in hesitation, in the way they recalibrated their expectations. Sometimes there was confusion, sometimes there was subtle resistance. I could feel it in the slight disappointment in their voices, in the way conversations shifted when I didn't respond the way I used to. These moments tested my resolve. Old instincts urged me to retreat, to apologize, to restore the familiar balance by sacrificing myself once more. But I stayed still. I reminded myself that discomfort was not danger and that other people's adjustment did not require my self-erasure. As I practiced this new way of being, I began to notice how much emotional energy I had been carrying that was never mine to begin with. I had absorbed the expectations of others as obligations, the disappointments of others as personal failures. Releasing that weight was both liberating and disorienting. I didn't always know who I was without it. There were evenings when I sat alone, unsure of what to do with myself now that I wasn't constantly needed. The quiet felt unfamiliar, almost too loud. But slowly, that quiet began to feel like space. Space to think, to feel, to exist without justification. One of the hardest truths I faced was this. I had taught my children how to treat me by the way I treated myself. This realization was painful, but it was also empowering. It meant that change was possible, even now. I couldn't rewrite the past, but I could shape the present. I could show them a version of their mother who valued herself, who spoke honestly, who rested without guilt. I didn't need their permission to do this. I only needed my own. By the end of that season, I no longer saw the good mother as something I had to destroy. I saw her as someone I could gently release. She had served her purpose in a time when survival demanded it. But I was no longer surviving, I was living, and living required something different. It required courage, not endurance. It required presence, not sacrifice. And it required the willingness to be misunderstood in order to remain true to myself. At 75, this shift didn't make me louder or harder. It made me quieter and clearer. I spoke less, but with more intention. I gave less, but with more honesty. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't realized was missing, a sense of dignity that came not from being needed, but from being whole. As the weeks passed, the changes I was making began to move from isolated moments into the rhythm of my everyday life. What had started as hesitant pauses before saying yes slowly became a new way of listening to my body, to my emotions, to the quiet truth I had ignored for decades. I no longer rushed to fill every gap with usefulness. I no longer reached for my phone out of habit alone. Instead, I began to ask myself a question that once felt unthinkable. Do I actually want to do this? That question did not always lead to comfort. Sometimes it led to loneliness. Sometimes it led to uncertainty. But it also led to something I hadn't felt in years: honesty. Living without apology did not mean living without kindness. That distinction mattered deeply to me. I wasn't withdrawing love or affection from my children. I was simply refusing to twist myself into shapes that no longer fit. I noticed how often I had used apologies as a way to soften my existence, as if merely having limits required justification. I'm sorry, I can't. I'm sorry, I'm tired. I'm sorry, maybe another time. These phrases had been woven into my speech so tightly that removing them felt like exposing myself. When I began to say, "I can't today," without the apology attached, my voice sometimes trembled, but each time I did it, the fear lost a little of its power. There were moments when the consequences of this shift were immediate. Conversations ended more quickly. Invitations stopped coming as often. People adjusted their expectations, sometimes without saying a word. I felt the absence sharply at first, wondering if my value had always been tied to my availability. That realization stung more than I expected. It forced me to confront a painful truth. When you are loved primarily for what you provide, your absence feels like inconvenience rather than loss. Accepting that truth required grieving, not just for myself, but for the relationships I thought I had and the way I had misunderstood them. At the same time, there were surprising moments of tenderness. When I stopped overextending myself, the time I did spend with others became more intentional. I listened more deeply because I wasn't exhausted. I spoke more honestly because I wasn't afraid of being abandoned for having limits. I laughed more freely because I wasn't silently calculating how much of myself I was giving away. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my presence changed. I was no longer performing care, I was offering it, and that difference mattered more than I could have imagined. I also began to notice how my body responded to this new way of living. The constant tension I had carried for years, the tight shoulders, the shallow breathing, the restless nights, started to soften. Not disappear, but ease. I slept better. I rested without guilt. I allowed myself afternoons with no agenda, something I once believed only lazy people did. Sitting quietly with a cup of tea, watching the light shift across the room, I realized how little space I had given myself simply to exist. At 75, this felt like reclaiming stolen time. Yet, even as peace crept in, doubt followed closely behind. Old beliefs do not loosen their grip easily. There were days when I questioned myself relentlessly. Am I becoming selfish? Am I withdrawing too much? Will I regret this later? These questions echoed the voices of a lifetime spent being evaluated, praised, and judged according to how much I gave. But each time the doubt surfaced, I returned to my body, to how it felt to live this way. I felt steadier. I felt clearer. I felt less resentful. Those sensations became my compass. One afternoon, I caught myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I made a decision purely because it brought me joy. I rearranged my living room, moved a chair closer to the window, and created a small space where I could sit and read. It was such a simple act, yet it felt revolutionary. No one had asked me to do it. No one benefited from it but me. And instead of guilt, I felt satisfaction. That moment stayed with me. It was a reminder that joy did not need permission. As my daily choices shifted, so did my sense of identity. For so long, I had introduced myself through my roles: mother, caretaker, supporter. Without realizing it, I had allowed those labels to eclipse everything else. Now I was learning to meet myself again, not as a role, but as a person. I noticed my preferences, my rhythms, my limits. I paid attention to what drained me and what nourished me. This wasn't self-indulgence, it was self-awareness, something I had never been taught to cultivate. The most difficult part of this transformation was accepting that not everyone would understand it. Some people prefer you predictable, especially when your predictability makes their lives easier. I had to make peace with being seen differently, with being labeled distant, changed, or even disappointing. At my age, that acceptance felt both heavy and freeing. I no longer had the time or energy to argue my worth. I let silence do the work. I let consistency speak for me. Over time, the people who could meet me in this new space remained, and those who couldn't drifted away. What surprised me most was how little anger I felt toward anyone else. The resentment I once carried had dissolved into clarity. I could see now that no one had forced me into the role of the good mother. I had stepped into it willingly, believing it was the highest form of love. Letting go of that belief didn't require blame, it required compassion, especially for the younger version of myself who didn't know there were other options. At 75, learning to live without apology didn't make me harder or colder, it made me gentler with myself. And in that gentleness, I found strength. I began to trust that I could love deeply without disappearing, that I could care without carrying everything, that I could exist without explanation. This wasn't a dramatic reinvention, it was a quiet return, a return to myself. It didn't take long for the people around me to notice that something had shifted. Change, even when it's quiet, has a way of announcing itself. It shows up in the pauses, in the altered rhythms, in the absence of the old reflexes people rely on. My children were the first to sense it, though none of them named it right away. Instead, it surfaced in small comments, in questions disguised as concern, in the way conversations gently tested the boundaries I was beginning to hold. "Are you feeling okay?" one of them asked more than once. "You seem different lately." Different. The word lingered with me, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. I was different, and for the first time, I didn't rush to reassure anyone that everything was fine in the familiar way they expected. The resistance, when it came, was subtle. It wasn't anger or confrontation, it was confusion. My children had known me as reliable, endlessly flexible, quietly self-sacrificing. That version of me had shaped the emotional landscape of our family for years. When I stepped out of that role, even gently, it disrupted something unspoken. I could see it in their faces when I didn't volunteer immediately, when I asked questions instead of offering solutions, when I didn't rearrange my life to accommodate last-minute plans. They weren't wrong to feel unsettled. Change always unsettles those who benefit from stability, even when that stability comes at someone else's expense. There were moments when old dynamics tried to reassert themselves. A familiar sigh, a carefully chosen phrase meant to invoke guilt, a reminder of how things used to be. These moments tested me deeply. I could feel the old patterns stirring, urging me to step back into my role, to restore the balance by sacrificing myself once again. The temptation was real. It would have been easier, in many ways, to return to what everyone knew. Familiar roles offer comfort, even when they cause harm. But I had crossed a threshold inside myself. I could not unsee what I now understood. Each time I held my ground, even quietly, I felt a strengthening, a sense that my identity was no longer up for negotiation. Not all responses were resistant. There were moments of unexpected understanding, too. One of my children listened more carefully than I anticipated. They didn't fully grasp what was happening, but they sensed its importance. In those moments, our conversations deepened. We spoke less about logistics and more about feelings, less about what needed to be done and more about how we were each doing. These exchanges were rare but meaningful. They reminded me that authenticity, even when uncomfortable, can invite connection rather than destroy it. Outside of my family, friends noticed the change as well. Some admired it, though they didn't always say so directly. Others were unsettled by it, as if my shift forced them to confront their own unexamined roles. When you change late in life, it can make others uneasy. It challenges the unspoken agreement that people remain consistent, predictable, contained. I learned quickly that my growth was not always welcome, but it was no longer optional. What surprised me most was how my internal dialogue changed in response to these external reactions. Where I once absorbed every raised eyebrow and subtle disappointment as evidence of my failure, I now paused. I asked myself whose discomfort I was truly responsible for. I considered the difference between being kind and being compliant. This distinction became a cornerstone of my new self-definition. Kindness, I realized, includes honesty. Compliance, on the other hand, often requires self-betrayal. I had spent too many years confusing the two. There were days when the loneliness pressed in harder than I expected. Letting go of a lifelong role creates space, but it also reveals emptiness where something once was. I grieved that emptiness. I grieved the version of myself who believed she had to disappear to be loved. I grieved the years I spent prioritizing harmony over truth. But grief, unlike guilt, felt cleansing. It honored what had been lost without demanding punishment. As I navigated these changing relationships, my sense of self grew clearer. I no longer introduced myself solely through my role as a mother. I spoke more about what I enjoyed, what I valued, what mattered to me now. These statements felt fragile at first, like newly planted seeds, but each time I spoke them aloud, they took deeper root. I was no longer defining myself by what I gave, but by who I was becoming. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult conversation, I sat alone and reflected on how far I had come. The urge to retreat still existed, but it no longer controlled me. I understood that being misunderstood was not the same as being wrong, that discomfort, while unpleasant, was not fatal, and that my worth did not diminish when I stopped being convenient. At 75, my self-definition was no longer borrowed from expectations placed on me decades ago. It was emerging from lived experience, from reflection, from courage. I was not trying to reclaim youth or reinvent my life dramatically. I was doing something quieter and more enduring. I was choosing alignment over approval, and in that choice, I felt something steady and grounded begin to form, a sense of self that did not require constant validation to exist. Acceptance didn't arrive all at once. It wasn't a sudden release or a triumphant feeling of relief. It came slowly, unevenly, in moments that felt almost ordinary. I would notice it while sitting alone with a cup of tea, realizing I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head the way I used to, or while making a decision without immediately checking how it might affect everyone else. These small shifts were subtle, but they carried weight. They signaled that something inside me was no longer constantly bracing itself for judgment or disappointment. I was beginning, quietly, to rest inside my own life. Guilt, however, lingered longer than I expected. It had been my companion for decades, woven so deeply into my sense of responsibility that it often masqueraded as love. Even as I accepted my right to exist beyond my role as the good mother, guilt would surface unexpectedly. It appeared in the pause before I said no, in the tightness in my chest when I chose rest over obligation, in those echoes of old beliefs that told me selflessness was the highest virtue, especially for women like me. I didn't try to banish guilt. I learned instead to observe it, to recognize it as a habit of thought rather than a moral truth. There were moments when guilt spoke loudly, when a child sounded disappointed on the phone, when plans changed because I no longer rearranged my days around everyone else's needs. In those moments, the old reflexes flared. I felt the urge to over-explain, to apologize excessively, to justify my choices. But something had shifted. I paused. I breathed. I reminded myself that discomfort does not equal harm, that someone else's disappointment did not mean I had failed. This pause, this brief interruption of a lifelong pattern, became a powerful act of self-respect. Freedom began to emerge in the spaces created by these pauses, not the loud, dramatic freedom of rebellion, but a gentle, steady one. It showed up in how I spent my mornings, in the books I read without rushing, in the way I allowed silence to stretch without filling it with usefulness. For years, my value had been tied to productivity and availability. Now I was discovering the pleasure of being unoccupied, not because I was no longer needed, but because I finally allowed myself to simply be. I noticed how my body responded to this change before my mind fully caught up. The constant tension in my shoulders softened, my sleep deepened. I wasn't as exhausted at the end of the day, even when I had done very little. This surprised me. I had believed for most of my life that rest had to be earned through sacrifice, that exhaustion was proof of virtue. Letting go of that belief felt both liberating and disorienting. Who was I if I was no longer tired from giving? Acceptance also meant acknowledging what could not be undone. There were years I would never get back, dreams I had postponed too long, parts of myself that had gone quiet from neglect. I allowed myself to mourn these losses without turning that grief inward as blame. I spoke gently to my younger self in my thoughts, the woman who believed she had no choice. I saw her now not as weak, but as shaped by expectations she never questioned because no one taught her to. This compassion softened the sharp edges of regret and allowed healing to begin. As guilt loosened its grip, my relationships subtly adjusted. Some grew quieter, others found a new rhythm. I stopped measuring closeness by how much I gave and began noticing how much was shared. Conversations became less transactional and more honest. I listened differently, not with the intention of fixing or accommodating, but with curiosity. This shift surprised people. It surprised me, too. I realized how often I had been present in body, but absent in spirit, consumed by the role I was performing. Now, when I showed up, I did so more fully, even if less frequently. Freedom also meant redefining love. I had equated love with sacrifice for so long that separating the two felt almost disloyal. But as I examined my life, I began to see how love rooted in obligation can quietly erode the soul. True love, I was learning, does not require disappearance. It allows for boundaries. It respects individuality. It does not demand constant proof through self-denial. This understanding did not make me love my children less. It allowed me to love them more honestly, without resentment quietly poisoning the space between us. There were evenings when I sat alone and felt a strange mix of peace and sadness. Peace because I was no longer fighting myself, sadness because this peace had come so late. I let both feelings coexist. I didn't rush to resolve the tension between them. Life, I was learning, doesn't always offer clean emotional conclusions. Sometimes maturity means holding complexity without needing to simplify it. Gradually, the guilt that once dominated my inner world lost its authority. It still appeared, but it no longer dictated my choices. I recognized it as a voice shaped by decades of conditioning, rather than a reflection of who I truly was. Each time I chose myself without collapsing into apology, that voice grew quieter, and in its place, a deeper sense of freedom took root. Not the freedom to escape responsibility, but the freedom to live with integrity. At 75, I was no longer seeking permission to exist as myself. Acceptance had settled into my bones, not as resignation, but as clarity. I knew who I was becoming, and I trusted that process. The woman emerging from this chapter of my life was not defined by endless giving or quiet endurance. She was defined by presence, honesty, and a newfound respect for her own humanity. And for the first time, that felt enough. There came a moment, not dramatic, not announced, when I realized I was no longer defending my boundaries. I wasn't rehearsing explanations or preparing for pushback before making decisions. The boundaries had settled into me so deeply that they no longer felt like walls I had to guard. They felt more like doors I chose when to open. This was new. For most of my life, boundaries had felt aggressive, almost cruel. Saying no had once felt like an accusation against my character. Now it felt neutral, calm, necessary, like breathing. I noticed it first in the smallest situations. When someone asked for my time, I checked in with myself before responding, not out of fear, but out of respect. If I was tired, I said so. If I didn't want to attend something, I declined without layering my answer with guilt or elaborate excuses. The world did not collapse. People adjusted. Some were surprised. Some were quiet. Some seemed relieved, as if my change gave them permission to consider their own limits. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. My identity, once blurred by years of constant accommodation, began to sharpen. I remembered preferences I had long ignored. I discovered new ones. I paid attention to what energized me and what drained me, not as a weakness, but as information. I stopped forcing myself into roles simply because I had always played them well. At 75, I was no longer interested in being admired for endurance. I wanted to be respected for honesty, even if that honesty disrupted old expectations. Peace began to feel different. Earlier in my life, peace had always felt borrowed, conditional, temporary, dependent on how well I managed everyone else's comfort. It vanished quickly when someone was unhappy. Now, peace stayed, even when conversations were awkward, even when someone disagreed with me, even when I disappointed someone I loved. This was unfamiliar territory. I had been trained to believe that peace was earned through sacrifice. I was learning that true peace comes from alignment. There were moments of doubt, of course. Old habits do not disappear quietly. Sometimes I would hear my own voice and think, "Who do you think you are now?" The question wasn't hostile, it was curious, unsettled, and my answer surprised me. I am someone who finally listens to herself. That answer felt solid. It didn't require validation. It didn't need applause. As my identity strengthened, I became less reactive. I no longer interpreted every emotional shift in others as a personal responsibility. If someone was upset, I listened without immediately absorbing their discomfort as my own. This was a profound shift. For decades, I had been an emotional sponge, soaking up tension and smoothing it out before anyone else had to feel it. Letting others experience their own emotions without rescuing them felt strange at first, almost negligent, but I began to see the respect in it. I was trusting them to handle their feelings just as I was trusting myself to handle mine. Relationships adjusted again, this time more deeply. Some conversations grew quieter but more honest. Some expectations fell away. I noticed that when I stopped overgiving, what remained was more authentic. I could tell who valued me for who I was, not just for what I provided. This clarity didn't make me bitter, it made me calm. I understood now that clarity is not cruelty, it is kindness without self-erasure. There was also a softness that came with this new peace. I was no longer tense, waiting for the next demand. I moved more slowly. I laughed more easily. I allowed myself moments of joy without immediately wondering if I deserved them. I began to feel at home in my own life rather than like a caretaker passing through it. I thought often about the word good. How much of my life had been shaped by the desire to be a good mother, a good woman, a good person. Good, I realized, had often meant compliant, quiet, and endlessly available. It rarely included self-preservation. At 75, I was redefining goodness. Good now meant truthful. It meant kind without self-harm. It meant present, not depleted. This redefinition brought a steady confidence, not loud, not proud, just steady. I no longer needed to explain my choices to feel secure in them. I trusted myself. That trust was perhaps the greatest gift of this chapter. I had spent a lifetime doubting my instincts, overriding them in the name of harmony. Now I honored them, and in doing so, I felt whole. Peace, I discovered, is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of self-betrayal. And once that lesson settles into you, it does not leave easily. It becomes the ground you stand on. By the end of this chapter of my life, I was no longer asking whether it was acceptable to choose myself. I was living as though it always had been. And in that quiet certainty, peace finally stopped feeling temporary. It felt permanent. As the days grew quieter, I began thinking less about what I had done wrong and more about what would remain after me. Not in the way people talk about legacies, no grand speeches, no achievements carved into stone, but in the smaller, truer ways. I wondered what my children would remember when my voice was no longer there to smooth things over. Would they remember a woman who disappeared into duty, or one who eventually found the courage to stand as herself? I hoped, quietly, that they would remember both and understand the difference. For a long time, forgiveness had felt like something I owed others. I forgave quickly, often before I fully understood what had hurt me. It was a habit born of survival. But self-forgiveness was something I had postponed for decades, as if it were indulgent or unnecessary. Now, in the stillness of this later season of life, I finally allowed it in. I forgave myself for not knowing earlier, for giving too much without asking why, for believing that love required disappearance, that forgiveness did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, like light filling a room that had been dark for so long I had forgotten its shape. I began to see my past with softer eyes. The choices I made were not failures of character, they were responses to the world I lived in. I had been praised for sacrifice, rewarded for endurance, loved for my usefulness. No one had taught me that love could exist without depletion. Understanding this did not erase the pain, but it placed it gently in context. I could finally grieve without blaming myself. The meaning of love itself began to change. I had once believed love was proven by how much you could carry, how much you could endure without complaint. Now I understood that love also lives in honesty, in presence, in mutual respect. Love does not demand that one person shrink so others can remain comfortable. Love grows best when it is shared, not hoarded by obligation. This realization reshaped how I related to my children. I stopped measuring our relationship by how needed I was. I measured it instead by how truthful we could be. Some conversations were awkward, some silences stretched longer than I liked, but beneath it all, there was something sturdier than before, an honesty that did not require performance. I was no longer trying to earn my place in their lives. I was simply occupying it. I thought often about what I wanted to pass on, not advice. Advice is easy to ignore, but example. I wanted my life, especially this later chapter, to show that it is never too late to return to yourself, that love does not expire when boundaries appear, that choosing yourself does not erase what you gave before, it gives it meaning. This tenderness and this understanding, I no longer resented the years I spent sacrificing. They were real, they were sincere, but I no longer glorified them either. Sacrifice without balance is not virtue, it is erosion. Recognizing that truth felt like closing a long open wound. Painful, yes, but healing. In forgiving myself, I found space to forgive the past without excusing it. I did not rewrite history, I simply stopped letting it define my worth. That distinction mattered. It allowed me to hold my story with dignity rather than regret. Legacy, I realized, is not about perfection, it is about permission. Permission to live honestly, permission to rest, permission to stop performing love and start practicing it in a way that includes yourself. If my children carried nothing else from me, I hoped they would carry that. At 75, love had finally shed its heaviness. It no longer felt like a test I had to pass. It felt like something shared between whole people, not extracted from one. And in that understanding, I felt lighter than I had in decades, not because my life had been easy, but because it was finally true. Time, I've learned, has a way of softening the edges of things you once believed were permanent. The roles I carried for most of my life, caretaker, fixer, emotional anchor, didn't disappear overnight. They loosened gradually, like a coat worn for so many years that you forget you can take it off. I didn't announce my change. I didn't explain myself repeatedly. I simply began living differently, and over time, others adjusted in ways I never expected. At first, the change unsettled people. My children noticed before they understood. I answered the phone with less urgency. I paused before saying yes. I no longer rushed to solve problems that were not mine to fix. Some of them mistook this for distance. Others thought I was tired or unwell. I let them wonder. I had spent a lifetime explaining myself. This time, I chose quiet consistency instead. Slowly, something shifted. Conversations changed tone. They became less transactional, less about what I could provide. Some calls were shorter. Some were warmer. A few were awkward. But beneath all of it, there was a new balance forming, unspoken, imperfect, but real. I was no longer the center holding everything together, and surprisingly, everything did not fall apart. In some ways, my children grew stronger without my constant presence and their struggles. They began solving their own problems, leaning on each other, finding confidence that had been quietly waiting beneath my over-involvement. Watching this stirred a complicated mix of pride and grief. I realized that my constant availability had once been a comfort, but also a crutch. Letting go allowed them to step fully into their own lives. With time, they began seeing me differently too, not just as mother, but as a woman with preferences, limits, and a history beyond them. Small moments revealed this shift. One of them asked my opinion without assuming I would agree. Another respected my decision to rest instead of attend a gathering. These were not dramatic changes. They were subtle but deeply meaningful. Peace, once something I guarded privately, began to show itself outwardly. I smiled more easily. My body felt less tense. Even my silence changed. It no longer felt heavy or defensive. It felt settled. People respond to that kind of peace. They may not understand it, but they sense it, and slowly they mirror it back. I noticed this not only with my children, but with friends, neighbors, even strangers. I no longer felt the need to prove my kindness. I didn't overextend myself to earn belonging. I listened more than I spoke. I chose where to place my energy with care. Life became quieter, but also richer, less crowded, but more intentional. Old expectations faded with time. The image others held of me, endlessly available, endlessly accommodating, began to dissolve. Some mourned that version of me, others adapted, and a few, surprisingly, seemed relieved. It turns out that when one person stops carrying everything, others are invited to carry their own share. There was freedom in that realization, not the loud, celebratory kind, but a calm, grounded freedom that seeps into your bones. I stopped waking up with that familiar knot in my chest. I slept better. I breathed deeper. Even my memory softened. The past no longer accused me, it simply informed me. Time also changed how I saw myself. I stopped measuring my worth by how indispensable I was. I stopped asking whether I had done enough. I began asking whether I was present with myself, with the moment, with the life I still had ahead of me. That shift changed everything. Relationships, once defined by obligation, began to redefine themselves around choice. When I showed up, it was because I wanted to, not because I felt required to. That distinction made my presence more genuine, more felt. Love, when it is chosen freely, carries a different weight. It is lighter, but stronger. There were still moments of doubt. Old habits don't disappear easily. Occasionally, guilt whispered that I was being selfish, but time proved otherwise. Nothing terrible happened because I chose myself. The world did not collapse. My children did not disappear. What changed was not love, but the way it moved between us. Peace, I realized, is not something you protect in isolation. When it is real, it spreads quietly. It alters how you speak, how you listen, how you respond. It teaches others how to meet you where you are rather than where you once were. At 75, I wasn't retreating from life. I was finally living it in a way that allowed everyone, including myself, to breathe. And that peace, once so fragile, now felt sturdy enough to share. There comes a point in life when clarity no longer feels sharp or frightening. It feels calm. That is what surprised me most. I had always imagined that choosing myself would feel dramatic, even cruel. But when it finally happened, it arrived softly, like a door closing without a sound. No arguments, no declarations, just a steady knowing that I had crossed into a different way of being. Closure didn't come from conversations or apologies as I once thought it would. It came from acceptance. I stopped waiting for my children to fully understand my choices. I stopped hoping someone would validate the years I had given. I realized that needing recognition was just another way of tying my worth to others. Letting go of that need felt like setting down a heavy bag I'd carried for decades without questioning why. For the first time, I looked back at my life without rewriting it. I didn't soften the sacrifices, but I no longer framed them as debts owed to me. I had loved deeply, I had given generously, and that was enough. Love does not require repayment to be real. This realization closed something old inside me, something restless that had always been asking, was it worth it? Clarity changed how I made decisions. I no longer measured them by how they would be received. I measured them by how they felt in my body. Peace became my guide. If something tightened my chest or stole my sleep, I let it go. If something felt steady and kind, I kept it. This simple filter reshaped my days in quiet but powerful ways. I began choosing rest without explaining it, joy without justifying it, distance without guilt. These choices did not harden me, they softened me. I became less reactive, less defensive. When old patterns tried to pull me back, when someone expected me to overgive or overextend, I recognized the feeling immediately, and instead of resisting loudly, I simply stepped aside. There was strength in that kind of refusal, not the strength of confrontation, but the strength of self-trust. I trusted myself to know when enough was enough. I trusted that love could survive boundaries. I trusted that my life still belonged to me, even at this age. The past no longer demanded answers. I had made peace with what I could not change. I stopped wishing I had been different. I stopped wondering who I might have been. I understood that every version of me had done her best with what she knew at the time. Forgiveness, I discovered, is not forgetting, it is releasing the need to keep punishing yourself. As this clarity settled in, I felt whole in a way I never had before, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer divided against myself. I wasn't torn between duty and desire. I wasn't bargaining with my own needs. I stood fully on my own side. Choosing myself did not make me less loving, it made my love honest. When I gave, it was because I wanted to, not because I feared being replaced, forgotten, or unloved. That difference changed everything. Love no longer drained me, it nourished me. This was not an ending filled with fireworks or grand gestures. It was quieter than that, but it was real. And it prepared me for the final understanding still waiting, one that would bring all of this into a single, lasting truth. At 75, I finally understood that life's most profound lessons are not shouted, they are felt, quietly in the way you choose to live your days. The wisdom of this chapter did not arrive through revelation or drama. It arrived in the steady realization that I had permission to exist fully, without explanation, without apology, and without the constant need for validation. I had spent decades giving pieces of myself to others, thinking that love was measured in sacrifice. But now I saw that the truest love, both for myself and for those around me, is not proven by exhaustion. It is proven by presence, honesty, and the courage to honor your own needs. I thought often about what I wanted my legacy to be. Not accolades, not admiration, not the memory of my endless work. I wanted my children to remember that it is possible to love fiercely and still remain whole. I wanted them to know that boundaries do not break relationships, they strengthen them. That forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, does not erase mistakes, it frees the soul to move forward with dignity. And that peace, once found, is not a fleeting guest to be earned, it is a steady companion that grows stronger when nurtured quietly, consistently, and without fear. Looking back, I realized that the most important choices I had made were not visible to anyone but me. The moments I decided to pause instead of rushing, the times I said no without apology, the mornings I allowed myself to rest without guilt. Each act was a quiet declaration of self-respect, a reclaiming of the life that had long been borrowed for others. And in those moments, I learned that the heart's capacity to love expands when it is no longer depleted. Love does not demand disappearance, it thrives in wholeness. I also saw how my life had changed the people around me. Some adapted, some resisted, some quietly learned from example. I was no longer performing for approval or protecting my worth through overgiving. Instead, I was living honestly. And in that honesty, I witnessed a subtle ripple, love and respect moving outward, not just inward, touching lives in ways I could not always see, but could deeply feel. This, I realized, is the kind of legacy that matters most, the kind that grows quietly, without fanfare, but leaves a permanent mark in hearts. There were moments of quiet triumph, too, tiny, almost imperceptible, yet monumental in their significance. I laughed more freely. I rested without guilt. I spoke truth without fear. I allowed myself joy, curiosity, and even indulgence without needing to justify it. And in every one of these moments, I recognized the power of choice, the quiet, unshakable power to shape a life according to your own values, even late in the game. That choice, once embraced, became the foundation of a life I had almost forgotten could belong entirely to me. I understood at last that the story of my life was not defined by endless sacrifice, nor by the applause or criticism of others. It was defined by the courage to remain present with myself, by the grace to forgive my younger self, and by the clarity to choose integrity over convenience. In choosing myself fully, I had discovered the ultimate paradox. The more I honored my own life, the deeper my love for those I cared about became. Love is not diminished by boundaries, it is amplified. And so I live now with a quiet confidence I never knew was possible. I am 75, aware of every day's fragility, yet grateful for its gift. I move through the world with honesty, gentleness, and the steady knowledge that my worth has never been borrowed. My story, my choices, my freedom, they are enough. And if there is one truth I wish to leave with anyone listening, it is this: it is never too late to choose yourself, to pause, to rest, to love without losing your own soul. And in that choice, you will find a peace that no one can take away, and a love that endures beyond sacrifice, beyond fear, and beyond time itself.